shots in 1929, the German film industry was preparing to release its first dialogue-synchronized fiction films, which were already well established in the USA. By contrast, at that moment when dialogue-based cinema was coming to life, Menschen am Sonntag appears to be heading in the opposite direction, even using relatively few intertitles. Instead, it carries its preoccupations with urban culture and the evasion beyond the city into nature through the medium of its incessant movements and gestures. The film's concentration on the city's signs, its hoardings, its posters, as well as its preoccupation with the multiple forms of urban motion, all serve to bind it more closely to the emerging documentary genre of the city film, this genre of the city film, which was prominent across Europe at that same moment, 1929 to the beginning of the 1930s. And these were films of vertiginous transits through cities, such as Ziege Vertow's celebrated film Man with a Movie Camera from 1929, set in Moscow and Kiev and other Soviet cities. A film by Alexander Hackenschmied, An Aimless Walk from 1930, which was a journey from central Prague to its urban peripheries. And one of the most celebrated of all, Walter Ruttmann's Berlin city film, titled Berlin Symphony of the Great City, filmed 2 years before Menschen am Sonntag in 1927, and many others. All of those films intended to have a particular impact upon the perception and vision of their spectators, who are transported on the journeys which those city films make. In the opening sequence of Walter Ruttmann's Berlin film, the viewer is propelled into the heart of the city after a lengthy journey by train. But many films, such as Menschen am Sonntag, take the reverse course, away from the heart of the city and towards its peripheries. And that journey is often one that makes a division for its spectator between the culture of the city and the natural environment beyond it. Many filmmaking techniques are used to convey such movements in the genre of the city film, including, for example, panning shots, panoramic shots filmed from above the buildings of the city, and jump cut shots which allow the journey to be made instantaneously and abruptly. As in the Hales Tours film journeys of the 1900s, which I mentioned earlier, one powerful way to convey urban movement to the spectator is to shoot images of the city from the front of a moving vehicle. And this approach is often used in Menschen am Sonntag. But that film also employs another, more distinctive way of involving the spectator's vision in the movement and velocity of the journey, which is by filming the vehicle in which the characters are traveling from the perspective of another moving vehicle, thereby imparting a sensory impression of great speed. In fact, a sense of dislocation or disorientation too, since the two speeds are often at variance. Two examples of this are, firstly, the shot of the train heading from Berlin towards the forests and lakes on its edge, which is filmed from a moving car alongside the train. In this case, the train is moving faster than the camera's position, thereby imparting an urgency to the journey from urban culture into the natural environment. And secondly, when the characters are returning to Berlin at the end of the Sunday, the shot of the omnibus on which they are standing is filmed from an adjacent vehicle. And in that case, the camera's position is moving faster than the omnibus and suddenly overtakes it, thereby intimating that the Sunday journey into a momentary paradise is now over. So the speed of the journey through space and the acceleration of time involves a particular impact on the spectator's perception, thereby preparing the way for future intense sensations as the film develops. For the spectator, as with the characters in the film, the speed of movement in that journey may in itself form a kind of evasion, away from habitual speed and time, thereby allowing a kind of immersive experience to be created for the spectator. As I mentioned, four friends make the journey in the film from Berlin into the natural environment beyond the city. In fact, they are not actually friends at the outset of the journey, and as well as becoming friends during its course, they also become lovers, rivals, enemies. And after the day's journey, they may never meet again. But as you'll see in watching the film this evening, a fifth character is also important to that journey. And this is the character Annie. Annie, a fashion model who remains asleep in bed for the entirety of the Sunday, thereby renouncing her participation in the complex sensory dynamics of the other four characters. Although this character is unconscious for the journey's duration, that character remains pivotal to the film's action. Once at the lakeside, her boyfriend telephones to their apartment to verify her condition. Shots of her still sleeping state are intercut into the journey, and the film's action ends with a sequence in which her boyfriend returns to their apartment in the evening, and she finally wakes up, believing that the duration of the journey is only now about to start. So that state of unconsciousness forms another kind of evasion, one of negating all experience of the journey beyond the urban environment. It's possible even to imagine that in her sleeping state, she could be dreaming the other four characters' journey of exploration with its urban, sexual, and conflictual dimensions. By her physical absence from the journey, she effectively brings it to a halt in time and space so that its momentum is stalled. And this kind of arrest of time has its counterpart in one of the documentary sequences of the film, in which a public photographer is taking images of a series of faces of Berliners who are out for their Sunday excursion. At first, the faces are in animated movement as they prepare to be photographed. Then the photograph is taken, and the movement of the face is transformed into a kind of phantom, a strange image, stilled and lifeless. Once a number of faces have been photographed, a sequence is shown of the faces together so that they resemble one of the sequences of figures in motion photographed by Edward Muybridge, which I mentioned earlier, or else an archive of images of the dead, like those kept in detention centers or detention camps. In the context of Menschen am Sonntag, the character of Annie, the model who refuses to wake up or to participate in the filmic journey from culture to nature, serves to emphasize that the journey is in fact an ephemeral and fragile one, which will vanish and evanesce at the end of the day as a phantasm, effaced from memory, leaving behind only its filmic trace. In that sense, the natural, non-urban destination of Menschen am Sonntag is in many ways a utopian one, dreamed and imagined, conjured from space, and inhabitable at most for a few moments. In order for there to be an urgent necessity to leave behind the real city, that city must be a presence which works to repel or to abject, to expel its inhabitants. In one sequence, the film shows the real city of Berlin as one full of traces of dirt, of detritus, decay. And since no explanation is provided by the film of how the streets came to amass that dirt, that detritus, it appears to be the habitual state, the normal state of the city, which demands that it be cleaned with jets of water and that its population leave it behind. The city is also a space of excess, overpopulated, its transport system packed to overflowing, its streets full of crowds heading in great masses towards factories. In 1929, at the time when the film was made, Berlin had a population of 4 million and was the fourth largest city in the world after New York, London, and Tokyo, despite the reduction in population resulting from loss of life in the First World War. That sense of the excess of the city is conveyed by the film principally through its documentary sequences, in contrast between shots of densely inscribed urban facades with huge hoardings covering its walls, set against the masses of human bodies attempting to traverse its expanse. That urban population then demands its utopian escape into a natural environment, away from the city. But since everyone can only leave on Sunday, that excursion itself becomes an excessive journey. So the landscape of lakes and forests on the edge of Berlin as the destination point of that journey from the urban metropolis is presented by the film and experienced by its characters as an ambivalently natural one, the reverse of the real city, and in conflict with it. Historically, the imaginative role accorded to forests in German cultural history has always been a powerful one. For example, in German Romanticism, in literature and visual art, and it retains a resonant status in contemporary culture, as for example in the work of the artist Anselm Kiefer. But in historical terms, that forest landscape at the periphery of Berlin was entirely artificial. It had been intentionally created and intensively used over a period of several centuries for hunting of animals, and for the provision of firewood. Most of the lakeside was privately owned. In 1929, at the time when the film Menschen am Sonntag was being filmed, that apparently natural landscape was being transformed for its urban inhabitants. The Berlin official city architect of that time, Martin Wagner, was building an immense bathing resort, the largest in Europe alongside the lake. And that natural landscape formed part of the urban property of Berlin within the city's official boundaries. So, in a sense, both the origin and the destination for the film's journey, the city and the natural landscape, were actually identical and formed part of the same space, able to encompass divergent elements, both the real city defined by rituals of work and also the utopian natural space of the city at its periphery, which formed separate and conflictual entities only through their recreation in film. So I've talked about the conflict of urban culture and nature in the film Menschen am Sonntag, and how that conflict is often mediated both by the speed of movement and also by sensory forms, such as disorientation, sexual passion, and vertigo. Movements between the real city and its natural or idealized utopian alternative can always involve a distinctive impact upon the perception of the human body, and also a revisualization that may entail particular experiments in film, such as those between narrative and documentary forms, as in Menschen am Sonntag. But the journey between culture and nature across film history can also generate more intensive sensations and manifestations, extending into monstrous or horrific dimensions in the form of filmic utopias in disintegration. And I'll now go on to give one or two examples of such journeys. So how does a natural or urban utopia in disintegration manifest itself in film? It can, for example, take the form of a more catastrophic experience than in Menschen am Sonntag, in which the natural utopia, conjured up by the journey of the four friends, simply vanishes at the end of the day and has been assembled by the intricate dynamics of their physical relationship, which then lapse as the figures part. But in all cases, that journey begins with the real city, with the journey out of urban space and into a natural environment, which may have become tainted, usually by a human presence, and is ready to fall apart. In the celebrated film of Francis Ford Coppola, Apocalypse Now, of 1979, that journey begins from the real city of Saigon, which the military assassin Willard glimpses only in the form of a fragment through the blinds of his windows. The real city is hardly a starting point at all. It forms a hallucinated urban origin for his river journey through a forest landscape which is often presented by the film as being Edenic, untouched by civilization, surrounded by the evidence of warfare, but dangerous only in that it contains wild animals. Willard's target for assassination, the Colonel Kurtz, has constructed his own miniature city or compound within the Cambodian jungle after evading his military status. It is a utopian city, apparently assembled from the ruins of a former Khmer dynasty settlement, defined by the natural landscape around it. But because it has become an entirely autonomous city, redefined by Willard's military superiors as a monstrous one, it has to be destroyed alongside the assassination of Colonel Kurtz. Once the utopian city is separated totally from the real city, it appears to present a threat to reality itself, so that the utopian city itself disintegrates or is destroyed by an exterior or internal power. In the case of Colonel Kurtz's utopian city, it is destroyed totally by aerial firebombing. The intrusion of civilization is one that immediately effaces the utopian city, which is simultaneously monstrous and Edenic. One of the most unique films, I think, in analysing that confrontation between utopian and urban space in its sensory dimensions, is a film directed in 1969 by the Japanese filmmaker Teruo Ishii, a film called Horrors of Malformed Men, in the context of the grotesque horror genre of Japanese cinema, a film which, like Menschen am Sonntag, had only a relatively brief period of release, of public availability, before being withdrawn by the film studio which produced it, and which has come to light again through its recent re-release. I'll be showing an extract from it in tomorrow's session. Again, as with Apocalypse Now, the film presents utopian natural space as one which can only come into existence through its distance from the real city, and by staging a confrontation with the normal forms of urban civilization. So the disintegration of utopian space is always closely linked to its tension with urban space, whose agents seek to infiltrate that utopia in order to destroy it as monstrous, if it cannot be reconfigured to become identical with the reality of urban space. So the film Horrors of Malformed Men positions its utopia upon an island off the seacoast of Japan. As with many other films which represent island environments as distanced from urban culture, but prone to being the sites of aberrant or monstrous transformations through that separation from the city. And numerous other films have used that same spatial motif of the island, such as the 3 film versions drawn from the novel by H.G. Wells, the novel The Island of Dr. Moreau. In Horrors of Malformed Men, a young doctor travels from Tokyo to the island on which his father has been working for many years to create what the father calls an ideal world in the form of a natural environment and community, which is simultaneously monstrous and outlandish, populated by amalgams of human and animal forms. The island environment is presented by the film as an Edenic one, an Edenic island of rivers and forests, but it abruptly transforms itself into an uncontrolled, excessive one when it is perceived through the alien vision of the young doctor. And like the utopian city of Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, the island is one prone to disintegration. When the father perceives that his son's presence threatens the island's autonomy, he prepares to destroy it himself by fire. In narrative terms, utopian environments beyond the real city extend into the domain of sensory excess and corporeal mutation, so that when the real city and its utopian version collide, then a disintegration of utopian space results. The natural environment necessarily becomes monstrous in sensory and corporeal terms in order to be supplanted or destroyed by the presence of urban culture and its agents, or through its own ingrained tensions with urban time and space. In many ways, such environments are the extension of that depicted in Menschen am Sonntag, an urban utopia which may only exist when its time and space are defined by its relationship to the real city, Otherwise, it may be subject to malfunction, to disintegration, and the loss of the natural. So, I've discussed the relationship between urban and utopian environments in relation to several films. But I'd like to end this presentation by raising a question which I'll also be dealing with in tomorrow's session. Are cinemas themselves, the spaces in which films are experienced, also utopian spaces within the architecture of the city that surrounds them? Cinemas are always positioned in close intimacy with the urban space around them and share many of the same architectural forms with that environment as reflections or mirrors of the city. But at the same time, the space of the cinema is an enclosed and autonomous one, which is separated from the durations and dynamics of the real city by the act of its spectators leaving urban time and space behind as they enter it. At many points in film history, such environments were perceived as magical and idyllic, cinematic Edens. They also possess a utopian dimension in architectural terms. Because cinemas acquired a negative reputation in their early years, negative reputation especially in the years 1905 to 1915, the time of the so-called Nickelodeon cinemas, which were seen as disgraceful and forbidding environments, the companies which owned cinemas then attempted to change their reputation by making them lavish and beautiful environments. One aspect of this was to insert natural elements into the decor of the cinemas, for example, waterfalls and fountains, depictions of rivers and forests, and to embellish the facades and foyers of the cinemas with images of the natural world. Another aspect was to present cinemas in the context of other kinds of buildings, for example, the architecture of palaces or of cathedrals. For example, in one of the largest concentrations of such cinemas in the USA, that of the Broadway Avenue in the downtown area of Los Angeles, one cinema's decor replicated that of the Palace of Versailles, while another cinema incorporated elements from the architecture of cathedrals, such as the Cathedral of Segovia. So cinemas became utopias, miniature Edenic cities, with their own rituals and sensations, existing within the city that surrounded them. Their natural environment would usually be inhabited only for a few hours, like the environment occupied by the characters of the film Menschen am Sonntag. But in terms of cinema architecture, the conflict between real and utopian cities was, in one sense, resolved in the 1920s by the design of buildings conceived explicitly as cinema cities, cine-cities. For example, the Roxy Cinema in New York, which combined an auditorium seating 6,000 people with a hotel, as well as other facilities such as a gymnasium, restaurants, shops, even a small hospital for people who might fall ill during the projection of the film, so that spectators could literally inhabit the Edenic city of film. Most of those lavish cinemas have now fallen into ruination or have vanished. But that journey into those utopian spaces of cinema is still a powerful one for contemporary filmmaking. The film In Search of a Midnight Kiss, directed by Alex Holdridge in 2008, has a sequence in which two characters who have just met, like the friends of the film Menschen am Sonntag, are walking in the downtown area of Los Angeles and decide to enter one of those palatial cinemas built in 1939 but now derelict or disused. This is a cinema called the $1 Million Cinema, which I showed the image of back. As soon as they evade the real cinema and have made their journey beyond it into the ruined cinema, they are immersed in another environment, another time and space, still possessing its original natural decor of rivers and forests and stars on the ceiling. And that kind of immersal within the Edenic cinematic space, even in a state of disintegration, incites powerful sensations for the few moments they inhabit it before their return to the real city. And this question of immersal in cinema, how people become immersed in cinema, may raise a final question about the status of contemporary cities, in which the space of cinema has often disappeared or has been transformed across the space of the past 10, 15, or 20 years. In many cities now, digital animated image screens in exterior urban space project much of the visual content which would previously have been experienced within the space of cinemas. And similarly, much of the contemporary experience of urban space is now undertaken online within digitized environments. So, journeys of evasion between the real city and its utopias, like that presented in the film Menschen am Sonntag, may become rare but more vital than ever. Okay, thanks very much. So I hope you enjoy the film Menschen am Sonntag, which lasts, I think, for about an hour and 15 minutes. In tomorrow's workshop seminar session, I'll be dealing more with the ideas I've presented about conflicts between natural and urban cultures. And I'll be showing extracts from the films which I've mentioned other than Menschen am Sonntag. Okay, thank you very much.